The alarm went off at 5 in the morning, just like every day. Emily Norton stretched her arm to silence it before the sound woke Brooke, her 12-year-old daughter sleeping in the room next door. The small 2-room apartment in Pinecrest Heights, Boston, was still shrouded in the darkness of early morning when she got up. Moving with the precision of someone who knows every inch of the space, Emily prepared a strong coffee and sorted out her daughter's medications, carefully organizing them in a colorful pill container. "Good morning, Mom," murmured Brooke, appearing at the door with her curly hair disheveled and her eyes still heavy with sleep. "Already awake, sweetie? Go back to sleep a little longer. It's still early, and Mrs. Zelda won't arrive until 7, replied Emily, kissing her daughter's forehead. "Did you take your evening medications?" Brooke confirmed with a nod. "I couldn't sleep well. I'm tired of being tired, Mum." Her daughter's words pierced Emily's chest like a cold blade. It was for Brooke that she woke up every day, faced the crowded buses and swallowed her pride. It was for her that she had accepted work as a nanny after 15 years of saving lives as a cardiologist. It was for Brooke that she held back tears when former colleagues recognized her on the streets of Beacon Hill, the wealthy neighborhood where she now worked. "You'll feel better soon," she said, trying to sound optimistic. "The health insurance has already authorized the appointment with the specialist for next month." Emily finished getting ready, wearing simple jeans and a plain blouse, the unofficial uniform she had created for herself. She picked up the backpack where she carried a home-prepared lunch and a change of clothes. She hugged Brooke once more, went over the instructions for Mrs. Zelda, the neighbor who looked after the girl during her absence, and left for the still dark street. Descending from the hill was the first challenge of the day. Emily knew every alley, every shortcut, every spot where the uneven pavement required extra attention. She walked with firm, quick steps, carrying not just the backpack on her shoulders, but a world of responsibilities and secrets. When she reached the bus stop, she blended into the crowd of workers who, like her, crossed the city daily to serve families in the South End. The 40-minute journey was her moment of transition. There, looking out the bus window, Emily left behind the woman she had been, Dr. Norton, a respected cardiologist at Boston Medical Center, and prepared to be just Emily, the silent and efficient nanny for the Bailey family. When she disembarked in Beacon Hill, the sun was already illuminating the facades of the luxurious buildings. She walked another 15 minutes until she reached the Bailey's mansion, located on a quiet, tree-lined street. She took a deep breath before ringing the doorbell. "Good morning, Emily," greeted Lauren Bailey, opening the door with perfectly styled hair, flawless makeup and designer clothes, even though it was only 7 in the morning. "Edward already left for the office, and Madison is still sleeping. She had a restless night." "Good morning, Mom. Any specific symptoms?" asked Emily, trying to contain the clinical tone that stubbornly emerged in her voice. "Nothing serious. She just woke up a few times." "You know how children are," replied Lauren, unconcerned, as she picked up her Italian designer bag that cost more than Emily earned in 6 months. "I have meetings all day. I'll be back for dinner." As soon as Lauren left, Emily went upstairs to Madison's room. She paused at the door, observing the 6-year-old girl sleeping wrapped in Egyptian cotton sheets. She approached slowly and sat on the edge of the bed, noticing the pinkish spots on the child's arms. She touched her forehead with the back of her hand, a gesture that mixed the nanny's affection with the doctor's precision, and noticed the slightly elevated temperature. "Good morning, Princess," she whispered when the girl's eyes opened. "Emmy," exclaimed Madison, using the nickname she had invented. "You were late today." "I arrived at the same time as always, little one. How are you feeling?" "Tired, and my tummy hurts a little." Emily smiled, hiding her concern. "Let's get up, have a nice breakfast, and then decide what to do today. How about that?" In the spacious, modern kitchen, Emily prepared a balanced meal for Madison, carefully observing each of the girl's reactions. She knew the signs. The child was eating less than usual, complaining of frequent abdominal pain and showing skin rashes that appeared and disappeared without explanation. She had tried to mention her concerns to the parents, but Lauren considered it an exaggeration, and Edward was rarely present to listen. "Emmy, why don't you wear a white coat like the doctors at the hospital?" Madison suddenly asked, while playing with the pieces of fruit on her plate. The question caught Emily by surprise. "Why are you asking that, Maddie?" "Because you always know when I'm sick, And you use difficult words like Dr. Robert. Emily swallowed hard. Dr. Robert was Madison's pediatrician, who saw her sporadically when symptoms became impossible to ignore. I just pay attention to you, dear. It's different. One day I want to be smart like you, declared the girl with the simplicity of childhood. Those simple words brought to the surface memories that Emily struggled to keep dormant. She remembered the years of college at Boston University Medical School, the sleepless nights studying, the exhausting hospital shifts, the lives she had saved. And then, the nightmare that followed when she decided to report the medical fraud scheme she had discovered. The distrust in colleagues' eyes, the isolation, doors closing one by one, until nothing remained but silence and oblivion. The day passed like so many others. Emily helped Madison with her homework, played with her in the garden, prepared lunch, and discreetly checked the child's vital signs during the afternoon nap. Around 6, the front door opened, announcing Edward Bailey's early arrival. Tall, with an imposing presence and always dressed in expensive suits, Edward was the typical successful businessman. He rarely arrived before 8, and his presence in the house at that hour caused surprise. "Daddy!" shouted Madison, running to hug him. "Hi, Princess," he replied, lifting his daughter into the air with a tired smile. His eyes met Emily's for a moment. "Any problems today?" "No, sir. Just homework and playing in the garden," she replied, omitting her concerns about the girl's health. She knew from experience that Edward would minimize the situation, attributing it to childish fussiness, as he often said. "Great. Did Lauren call? She should be arriving later." "I didn't receive any messages, sir." Edward nodded, putting Madison on the floor. "You can go then. Tomorrow is Friday. Don't forget that Lauren will travel to New York with her mother. You'll need to stay later." "Yes, sir. I'll be here." While gathering her things to leave, Emily heard Edward on the phone talking about numbers, contracts, and deadlines. His voice was firm, different from the hesitant tone he used with his daughter. Two distinct worlds, she thought, just like hers, that of Dr. Norton, which lay dormant, and that of Emily the nanny, which now lived. She said goodbye to Madison with a tight hug, promising to return the next day. The girl, as always, asked for another story before bedtime, a request that Emily couldn't deny, even knowing that the bus was already on its way to the stop. As she left the mansion, Emily breathed in the night air that was beginning to fall over Boston. From the heights of Beacon Hill, the city lights created a carpet of artificial stars. On the horizon, the mountains of Massachusetts drew dark contours against the sky. Somewhere among those lights was her home, her daughter, and the reality she hid from everyone. Walking to the bus stop, Emily allowed herself a moment of reflection. How much longer could she live this double life? How much longer could she ignore the worrying signs in Madison's health, knowing she had the knowledge to help her, but not the authority to intervene? Life had taught her in the hardest way that some battles cannot be won, but her instincts as a doctor and as a mother screamed ever louder. The bus appeared at the corner, bringing her back to the present. She got on, sat by the window, and let her gaze get lost in the city passing by outside, carrying with her the weight of the two women who inhabited her body, the silenced doctor and the invisible nanny. Friday dawned with Boston's sky covered by heavy clouds, a harbinger of the rain to come. Emily woke up to the sound of Brooke coughing in the next room. She quickly got up and went to her daughter, who was sitting on the bed, breathing a little heavily. "It's okay, Mum. I just choked on my saliva," explained the girl, trying to reassure her. Emily sat next to her daughter, fixing the rebellious hair that framed Brooke's pale face. She took the stethoscope kept in the dresser drawer, the only instrument she had kept from her old life, and listened to her daughter's heartbeat. The rhythm was regular but faster than she would have liked. "I'll leave your morning medicine sorted out, Mrs. Zelda will keep an eye on you to make sure you take it at the right time," she said, kissing her daughter's forehead. "Rest today. No walking around the neighborhood with your friends." "Mom, I'm not a little kid anymore," protested Brooke, rolling her eyes as only teenagers know how to do. "You'll always be to me. And a doctor is worse than a mother. Imagine both together." Brooke smiled, a weak smile that didn't hide the chronic fatigue that accompanied her. Emily swallowed the lump that formed in her throat. The health insurance she had obtained as an employee of the Baileys was the only way to ensure the treatment her daughter needed. She couldn't afford to lose that job, even if sometimes she felt she was betraying herself and her vocation. The journey to Beacon Hill that morning seemed longer. The crowded bus moved slowly through the congested streets while the rain began to fall. Emily looked through the foggy window, observing the contours of the city that distorted through the water drops. A city of contrasts, where just a few miles were enough to separate completely different realities. Upon arriving at the Bailey mansion, she found unusual activity. Lauren, elegantly dressed, was giving hurried instructions to Edward, who seemed uncomfortable with the situation. "Emily, thank God you're here," said Lauren as soon as she saw her enter. "I need to leave in 10 minutes to catch the flight to New York. My mother is already at the hospital waiting for the procedure." "Any problem, Mum?" asked Emily, trying to maintain a neutral tone despite her curiosity about the health of Edward's mother-in-law. "Nothing serious, just a routine procedure that requires accompaniment. The problem is that Edward will be responsible for Madison the entire weekend. It's the first time since—" Lauren hesitated, looking at her husband with an indecipherable expression. "Well, since ever?" Edward looked like a fish out of water, holding a planner in one hand and his cell phone in the other, while trying to pay attention to his wife's instructions about medication schedules and his daughter's food preferences. "Emily will stay until later today?" he asked, interrupting Lauren's monologue. "Yes, I arranged for her to leave at 9 after Madison is asleep," replied Lauren, looking at Emily for confirmation. "No problem, Mum." Lauren finished packing her suitcase, kissed her still sleeping daughter, and left in a hurry, leaving behind a visibly anxious Edward and an Emily, who observed everything with clinical attention. "I have meetings all day on the computer," said Edward, breaking the awkward silence that settled after his wife's departure. "Can you stay with Madison? I'll be in the office, but call me if you need anything." "Of course, sir, that's my job," replied Emily, holding back a sigh of frustration. Edward spoke as if he were asking for an extraordinary favor, when in fact he was merely describing the function he paid her for. The day went smoothly until mid-afternoon. Madison was quieter than usual, refusing her snack and complaining of leg pains. Emily checked her temperature, slightly elevated, and decided it was time to alert Edward. She knocked on the office door and waited. The deep voice authorized her entry, and she found her employer immersed in papers and with his gaze fixed on the computer screen. "Sir, excuse me for interrupting, but Madison isn't feeling well. I think it would be good to give her some fever reducer." Edward frowned, as if processing information in a foreign language. "She has a fever? It must be a virus, right? Children always catch these things. The temperature is 100 degrees Celsius. It's not alarming, but considering the other symptoms she has been showing in recent weeks, I think it's prudent to monitor," explained Emily, struggling not to sound like the doctor she once was. "Other symptoms? What other symptoms?" questioned Edward, finally taking his eyes away from the screen and facing Emily. "The skin rashes, constant fatigue, leg pains. I've already mentioned it to Mrs. Bailey, but she thought it wasn't anything serious." Edward seemed genuinely surprised. "Lauren didn't tell me anything about this." A heavy silence settled between them. Emily realized she had touched on a sensitive point, the fragmented communication of the couple, especially when it came to their daughter. "I'll give her the fever reducer and continue observing. If the temperature rises, you will be informed immediately," said Emily, retreating to the door. "Wait," Edward called before she left. Do you think we should take her to the doctor?" The question caught Emily by surprise. It was the first time Edward had asked for her opinion about something related to his daughter's health. "I believe it would be prudent to schedule an appointment for next week. Yes, better to prevent." Edward nodded, thoughtful. "Take care of her. I'll try to finish this as quickly as possible to help." Emily returned to Madison, who was now lying on the living room sofa, watching cartoons with a sleepy look. She gave her the fever reducer and sat beside her, stroking her hair with the delicacy of someone touching something precious. "Emmy, tell me a story," asked the girl with a weak voice. "What kind of story do you want to hear today?" "A superhero story, but not one of those fantasy ones, a real one." Emily smiled, thinking about what to tell. She decided to adapt a real story, something from her past that could inspire Madison without revealing too much. Once upon a time, there was a woman named Helen who worked in a big hospital. She didn't have superpowers like flying or becoming invisible, but she had something very special. She could hear people's hearts and understand when something wasn't right. Like with a stethoscope? Asked Madison, interested. Yes, she used one. But the real power was in paying attention to the small details that no one else noticed. One day, Helen realized that an elderly gentleman who had gone to the hospital several times was being treated incorrectly. Why? Because sometimes even doctors make mistakes, Maddie, and some don't like to admit when they're wrong. That's stupid, declared the girl with the brutal honesty typical of children. Emily laughed. Yes, it's stupid. Helen tried to talk to the other doctors, show them what she had discovered, but no one wanted to listen, so she decided to do the right thing, even knowing she could have problems. And what happened? Asked Madison, completely involved in the story. Emily hesitated. How to explain professional persecution, defamation, and isolation to a 6-year-old child? Some people got angry with her. Helen had to leave the hospital, but she never regretted helping that gentleman. Because sometimes, Maddie, being a hero means doing the right thing, even when it's difficult. And where is she now? Asked Madison, with her eyes already heavy with sleep. She found another way to help people, different but still important. Madison yawned, nestling closer to Emily. I liked that story. I want to be like Helen when I grow up. You'll be much more, little one, whispered Emily, as the girl fell asleep in her arms. The rest of the afternoon passed slowly. The rain intensified outside, creating a curtain of water that isolated the mansion from the rest of the world. Edward left his office a few times to check on his daughter, surprising Emily with his genuine, albeit awkward, interest. Around 7 in the evening, Edward appeared in the living room, where Emily was organizing Madison's toys. Emily, I need to go to the office to get some documents. It will be quick, half an hour at most. Is Madison sleeping? Yes, sir. The fever has subsided and she's resting. Great, I'll be back soon. Call me if anything happens, he said, handing her a card with his personal number. As soon as Edward left, Emily went upstairs to check on Madison. The girl was sleeping peacefully, her breathing regular, her skin less warm to the touch. Emily adjusted the covers and decided to take the opportunity to prepare dinner. In the large modern kitchen, Emily moved with the efficiency of someone accustomed to optimizing time. While cutting vegetables for a light soup, her thoughts wandered between Brooke, alone at home, and Madison, sleeping upstairs. Two such different children, but equally important in her life. The sound of something falling on the upper floor interrupted her thoughts. She dropped the knife and ran upstairs, her heart racing with apprehension. Upon entering Madison's room, she found her on the floor beside the bed, with her eyes half closed and irregular breathing. "Maddie? Madison!" she called, kneeling beside the child. There was no response. The girl's lips were pale, her skin cold and damp. With the precision of years of medical training, Emily checked the vital signs: weak and rapid pulse, shallow breathing. She recognized the signs of severe hypoglycemia, probably aggravated by the fever and reduced food intake during the day. Without thinking twice, Emily took her cell phone and called Edward. "Sir, it's an emergency. Madison fainted and needs immediate medical attention. I'm calling an ambulance." Edward's voice on the other end of the line sounded distant in panic. "My God, I'm coming back right now." Emily hung up and immediately dialed the emergency service, providing the address and symptoms with the clarity of a healthcare professional. While waiting, she properly positioned Madison, elevating her legs to improve blood flow and constantly checking her vital signs. The minutes that followed seemed like an eternity. The rain pounded the windows, creating an anguishing symphony that accompanied Madison's irregular breathing. Emily talked to her, trying to keep her conscious, using techniques she knew well from her hospital days. When she finally heard the front door being violently opened, Emily knew Edward had arrived. The heavy footsteps on the stairs announced his presence even before he appeared at the door, soaked and breathless. "What happened?" "My daughter," he stammered, approaching with his face contorted by fear. "Severe hypoglycemia. The ambulance is on its way. I managed to stabilize her for now, but she needs hospital care," explained Emily, without taking her eyes off Madison. Edward seemed paralyzed, unable to process what was happening. I don't know what to do," he admitted with a choked voice. "Now we can only wait for the ambulance and stay calm," replied Emily, with a firmness that came from years of dealing with emergencies. "Talk to her, hold her hand. She needs to feel that she's not alone." Obeying like a lost child, Edward knelt on the other side of his daughter and held her small hand between his. "Daddy's here, Princess. Everything will be fine," he whispered, with tears in his eyes. At that moment, as the rain continued to fall over Boston, something changed between Emily and Edward. The invisible barriers of class and hierarchy that separated them seemed to have been temporarily suspended by the urgency of the situation. They were no longer employer and employee, but two people united by concern for a child they loved, each in their own way. The sound of the siren cut through the night, announcing the arrival of the ambulance. Emily took a deep breath, preparing for what would come next. She knew that night would change many things, for Madison, for Edward, and inevitably for herself. The hospital waiting room pulsed with that peculiar anxiety of places where life and suffering coexist side by side. Edward paced back and forth, running his hands through his disheveled hair, while Emily remained seated, her back straight, and her gaze fixed on the door where the doctors would appear at any moment. The rain continued outside, a silent witness to that night that would change everything. "How did you know what to do?" Edward suddenly asked, stopping in front of Emily. It was the first time he had spoken since they had arrived at the hospital almost 2 hours ago. "With Madison, you seemed to know exactly what was happening." Emily hesitated. This was neither the time nor the place to reveal her past. "I took a first aid course a few years ago," she replied, looking away. "No, it was more than that," insisted Edward, sitting next to her. The paramedics commented on the correct positioning, on the precise assessment of symptoms. "They said you saved her life. Anyone would have done the same, sir." "No, they wouldn't have," he retorted, with unusual frankness. "I didn't know what to do. I was paralyzed seeing my daughter unconscious. If it wasn't for you—" The words hung in the air, loaded with a meaning that neither of them was ready to fully explore. They were saved by the appearance of a middle-aged doctor, who approached with a serious expression. "Family of Madison Bailey?" Edward jumped up. "I'm her father." "How is she, doctor?" "Stable now," replied the doctor. "Your daughter had an acute hypoglycemic episode, aggravated by an infectious condition. Fortunately, the pre-hospital care was excellent, which avoided major complications." "And what caused this?" asked Edward, his voice trembling. The doctor hesitated, looking from Edward to Emily with a questioning expression. "You are Emily Norton, Madison's nanny," she replied, standing up as well. "Ah, it was you who provided the first aid, correct?" The paramedics mentioned a rather professional intervention. Emily nodded, feeling Edward's curious gaze on her. "Well, Mr. Bailey, we performed some preliminary tests, and there are indications that your daughter may have a condition that affects glucose metabolism. We'll need to do more specific tests to confirm the diagnosis, but we suspect a form of diabetes atypical for her age, possibly associated with some autoimmune condition." Edward turned pale, leaning against the nearby wall. "Is it serious?" "It's a condition that will require continuous monitoring, but that can be perfectly controlled with proper treatment. The important thing now is to fully understand her situation." "When can I see her?" asked Edward. "Soon. She's resting. She received intravenous glucose and is responding well. One of the nurses will call you as soon as possible." When the doctor walked away, Edward and Emily sat back down, each absorbed in their own thoughts. The silence between them was dense, loaded with unformulated questions and untold truths. "You already suspected something like this, didn't you?" Edward finally asked, looking directly at Emily. She took a deep breath before answering. "I noticed some signs over the past few weeks. The skin rashes, constant fatigue, the leg pains she mentioned. These are symptoms that can indicate metabolic alterations." "And why didn't you say anything?" "I did say something, sir. I mentioned it to Mrs. Bailey more than once, suggested an appointment with the pediatrician. But Emily left the sentence unfinished, not wanting to sound accusatory. "But we weren't heard," completed Edward, running his hands over his tired face. "Neither you nor Madison. We were too busy to notice that our daughter was sick." The guilt in his voice was palpable, and Emily felt a twinge of compassion. "Children can be very resilient, sir, and some symptoms are subtle at first. Don't blame yourself." Edward let out a bitter laugh. "Not blame myself? I've spent the last few years prioritizing my company over my family. I barely know my own daughter. And today, when she needed me most, I froze like an idiot." "Fear is natural when it comes to our children," said Emily, thinking of Brooke and the countless nights she had stayed awake, fearing the worst. "What matters is what we do after the fear." Edward looked at her with renewed curiosity. "Do you have children, Emily?" "A 12-year-old girl, Brooke." "I didn't know that," he admitted, seeming genuinely surprised. "We never talked about you." "It's not part of the job, sir," she replied with a slight smile. A nurse appeared at the door of the waiting room. "Mr. Bailey, you can see your daughter now." Edward got up quickly, but before following the nurse, he turned to Emily. "Come with me," he asked, with a vulnerability she had never seen in him before. "Madison will want to see you too." Surprised by the request, Emily followed Edward through the familiar hospital corridors. How many times had she walked those same paths, wearing a white coat and carrying a stethoscope around her neck? The characteristic smell of disinfectant, the muffled sound of conversations and equipment, everything brought back memories she had tried to bury. Madison was lying in a bed that seemed too big for her small body. IV tubes and monitors surrounded her, but her eyes were open and brightened when she saw her father and Emily entering the room. "Emmy!" exclaimed the girl, with a weak but excited voice. "Daddy said you saved me." Emily approached the bed, affectionately fixing the child's hair. "Are you feeling better, little one?" "I am, but I don't like these needles," replied Madison, making a face at the IV in her arm. "They're helping you get strong again," explained Emily. "They'll be out soon." Edward observed the interaction between the two with a different look, as if seeing something that had always been there, but that he had never really noticed. "The nurse said I'll have to take injections," commented Madison, pouting. "I don't want to." "There to help you get well, Princess," intervened Edward, sitting on the edge of the bed and holding his daughter's hand. "And I bet you're brave enough to handle it." "You'll learn to be strong like a lioness," added Emily, "and you'll see it's not as bad as it seems." A nurse entered the room, bringing a clipboard. "Excuse me for interrupting, but we need some additional information about the patient's medical history." Edward looked confused. "Wouldn't it be better to talk to my wife? She's the one who always takes Madison to the doctor." "You can give us a contact number, and we'll try to speak with her," replied the nurse. "But we need this information as soon as possible to adjust the treatment." "I don't know much," admitted Edward, visibly embarrassed. "Emily, would you know how to answer?" Emily nodded, surprised by the request. "I can try." She accompanied the nurse out of the room, where she answered questions about allergies, vaccinations, and previous episodes of similar symptoms. She spoke with the confidence of someone who knew not only the patient, but also the medical language, which did not go unnoticed by the professional. "Do you have any healthcare training?" asked the nurse, curious. "I've worked in a hospital before," replied Emily vaguely. When she returned to the room, she found Edward sitting close to the bed telling a story to Madison, who was already fighting against sleep. The scene touched Emily deeply. It was the first time she had seen the businessman truly connected with his daughter, without the usual rush or distant look. "She's almost asleep," whispered Edward when Emily approached. "The doctor said she needs to rest. That's best for her now." "You must want to go home," he said, checking his watch. "It's already past midnight. I apologize for keeping you here so late." "Don't worry about that," replied Emily. "I called my neighbor, and she's with Brooke." "Even so, you must be exhausted. I can call a taxi to take you." "I appreciate it, sir, but I prefer the bus. There are still some running at this hour." Edward frowned, seeming troubled. "It's not safe for a woman alone on public transportation at this hour. I'll order a rideshare for you." Before Emily could protest, he was already on his phone requesting the service. "It's the least I can do after everything you did for Madison today." "I just did my job, Mr. Bailey." "No, Emily," he said seriously. "You did much more than that, and I think it's about time we talked about who you really are." Emily's heart raced. "I don't understand what you mean." "Yes, you do," he countered, with a penetrating look. "No ordinary nanny would know how to do what you did today." The paramedics commented that the procedure was perfect, as if it had been performed by an experienced doctor. Emily felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. Her carefully guarded secret was about to be revealed. "This isn't the time for this conversation," she said, trying to buy time. "Madison needs you here, and I need to go home to see my daughter." Edward nodded, reluctantly. "You're right, but this conversation will happen, Emily, tomorrow. I want to understand why someone with your skills is working as a nanny in my house. Not all stories have simple explanations, sir, she replied, heading to the door. Lauren is trying to get back from New York, informed Edward, changing the subject. But with the rain, flights are delayed. She'll arrive only in the morning. Madison will be fine. The team at this hospital is excellent. How do you know? He asked with genuine curiosity. Emily hesitated before answering. I've been here before. Before Edward could ask more questions, his cell phone vibrated. Your car has arrived, he informed, after checking the message. Go rest and... Thank you, Emily, really. She nodded and left the room, feeling Edward's gaze following her until she disappeared down the corridor. As she walked to the hospital exit, Emily passed places that were once part of her routine. The third-floor nursing station, where she used to have coffee during overnight shifts. The doctor's room, where she discussed complex cases with colleagues who probably didn't even remember her name now. The chapel, where she had cried after losing her first patient. The hospital wasn't just a place. It was an entire chapter of her life that had been abruptly ended. And now, as if in a poorly written novel, fate had brought her back through the hands of a child. In the car, Emily allowed herself a moment of weakness. Silent tears rolled down her face as the nighttime city passed by the window. She wasn't crying out of sadness, but because of the complexity of feelings that flooded her, the relief that Madison was well, the fear of having her past exposed, the timid hope that perhaps, just perhaps, her life could take a new direction. When the car stopped in front of the housing complex where she lived, the rain had already diminished to a light drizzle. She thanked the driver and walked to her building, feeling the weight of the day in each step. Upon opening the apartment door, she found Mrs. Zelda asleep on the sofa and Brooke in her bed breathing peacefully. Emily sat next to her daughter, observing her serene face as she slept. She gently touched her hair, being careful not to wake her. "For you, my love," she whispered. "Everything for you." She lay down next to Brooke without bothering to change clothes or take a shower. The fatigue was so great that in minutes she was sleeping, but her sleep was restless, populated by dreams where white coat and nanny uniform mixed, where hospital corridors transformed into stairs of the Bailey mansion, where voices from the past urgently called her name. At the hospital, Edward remained beside Madison's bed, observing his daughter's sleep while his mind worked, trying to connect the pieces of the puzzle that was Emily Norton. The silent and efficient nanny who, for one night, had transformed into something completely different. Someone with knowledge, confidence, and a natural authority that had impressed even the experienced doctors in the emergency room. With his cell phone, he discreetly searched for Emily's name. Nothing relevant appeared immediately. He hesitated and then added "doctor" to the search. The results surprised him. Academic articles from years ago, mentions in medical publications, a faded graduation photo from Boston University Medical School. The woman in the photo smiled with confidence, the bright eyes of someone who had the future ahead of her. She was younger, but unmistakably Emily, the same one who now cleaned the house and took care of his daughter for minimum wage. "Who are you really, Emily Norton?" Edward murmured to himself, as the first rays of sunlight began to enter through the slits in the hospital blinds, announcing a new day and, possibly, a new beginning for all of them. Saturday dawned with a surprisingly clear sky, as if the storm of the previous night had washed not only the streets of Boston, but also the accumulated tensions. Emily woke up startled, momentarily confused to realize that she was still wearing the clothes from the day before. Beside her, Brooke slept peacefully, her rhythmic breathing a constant reminder of why she did everything she did. She got up carefully so as not to wake her daughter, and found Mrs. Zelda in the kitchen preparing coffee. "Girl, you gave me such a scare yesterday," exclaimed the neighbor, a robust lady with gray hair and a welcoming smile. "Coming home after midnight, all wet from the rain. Did something happen at the rich folks' house?" Emily accepted the cup of coffee offered to her, grateful for the gesture. "My employer's daughter had a medical emergency. I had to accompany them to the hospital." "And how about your job now? Will they need you on the weekend?" The question caught Emily by surprise. With everything that had happened, she hadn't thought about the next steps. "I don't know, Mrs. Zelda. Probably yes, at least to check on the girl." "And Brooke, will she be alone again?" Emily felt the weight of guilt, a familiar burden she had carried for years. "I'll talk to her. Maybe I can take her with me, depending on the situation." Mrs. Zelda shook her head, in a gesture that mixed understanding and disapproval. "You bend over backwards for this family that isn't even yours, while your own daughter—" "It's precisely for Brooke that I do this," interrupted Emily firmly. "The health insurance I got as their employee is what guarantees her treatment." The conversation was interrupted by the ring of her cell phone. Emily answered, recognizing Edward Bailey's number. "Good morning, sir," she said, trying to maintain a professional tone, despite the forced intimacy that the emergency situation had created between them. "Emily," Edward's voice sounded tired, but calmer than the night before. "Madison is well. She'll be discharged in the next few hours. Lauren arrived from New York and is with us now." "I'm glad to hear that, sir." There was a pause before Edward continued. "We need to talk, not over the phone. Could you come to the hospital? Or perhaps we can meet somewhere else if you prefer." Emily felt her stomach sink. She knew this conversation was inevitable, but still wasn't prepared. "I can go to the hospital, sir, but I'll need to bring my daughter with me if that's not a problem." "Of course, no problem," he replied, sounding genuinely understanding. "In fact, it would be good for Madison to have company her age." "Brooke is 12 years old, sir. She's a bit older than Madison. Still, I'm sure they'll get along. We'll be waiting for you." After hanging up, Emily spent a few moments contemplating the cell phone, as if it could offer some guidance about what was to come. Mrs. Zelda observed her with curiosity. "Problem?" asked the neighbor. "I don't know yet," replied Emily honestly, "but I think my life is about to change." Waking Brooke and explaining the situation was easier than Emily expected. The girl, despite the chronic fatigue that accompanied her, was excited at the prospect of seeing her mother's workplace and the family she heard so much about. "Is Madison nice?" asked Brooke, while getting ready. "Very much so. I'm sure you two will get along," replied Emily, helping her daughter choose an outfit. "But remember, she's recovering from a health problem, so we have to be gentle." "Like me when I feel bad?" asked Brooke, with the precocious wisdom of someone who has lived with limitations from an early age. "Something like that, yes." During the journey to the hospital, Emily tried to organize her thoughts. What would she say to Edward? How much of her story was she willing to share? And how would this affect her job, on which she depended not only for her livelihood, but mainly for Brooke's treatment? They arrived at the hospital shortly after 10 in the morning. Emily held Brooke's hand firmly as they crossed the familiar lobby. It was strange to enter there as a visitor, after so many years entering as a doctor, with the white coat that had once been her uniform and her identity. In Madison's room, they found the family gathered. Edward looked exhausted, with deep circles under his eyes and unshaven, but there was a softness in his gaze that Emily didn't know. Lauren, impeccably dressed even after an emergency trip, was sitting next to her daughter's bed, running her fingers through the girl's hair while talking to a doctor, whom Emily immediately recognized, Dr. Richard Matthews, her former residency colleague. "Emily!" exclaimed Madison upon seeing her, lighting up with a smile. "You came to visit me?" "Of course, little one," replied Emily, approaching the bed, "and I brought someone for you to meet. This is my daughter, Brooke." The two girls looked at each other with the natural curiosity of childhood, immediately starting a conversation about games and cartoons. Lauren stood up and greeted Emily with a surprisingly warm hug. "Edward told me everything," she said, with a choked voice. "If it wasn't for you—" "I just did what anyone would do," replied Emily, embarrassed by the attention. "No, you didn't," intervened Edward, approaching, "and I think everyone here knows that now." Dr. Richard's gaze fixed on Emily, his eyes widening in belated recognition. "Emily? Emily Norton?" An uncomfortable silence settled in the room. Emily felt that all the pieces were falling into place in a way that she could no longer control. "You know each other?" asked Lauren, confused. Dr. Richard hesitated, looking from Emily to the Baileys. "We worked together a few years ago at Boston Medical Center." "Worked together?" repeated Edward, staring at Emily intensely. "As doctors, I imagine." Emily took a deep breath, feeling the weight of years of silence finally dissipating. "Yes, as doctors. I was a cardiologist for 15 years. The confession hung in the air like something physical, reorganizing the dynamics of the room. Lauren seemed completely perplexed. Edward had an expression of confirmation, as if he had finally solved a puzzle, and Dr. Richard seemed divided between surprise and embarrassment. "I think we should continue this conversation somewhere else," suggested Edward, looking at the girls who, oblivious to the adults' tension, had started a card game that Brooke had taken from her backpack. "I agree," replied Emily, feeling strangely relieved to no longer have to hide who she was. They went out into the corridor, leaving the girls under the supervision of a nurse. Dr. Richard excused himself and walked away, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. Edward, Lauren, and Emily found a small, empty waiting room and sat down. "Why didn't you tell us?" asked Lauren, still processing the information. "All this time, a doctor working as a nanny in our house." "It wasn't relevant to the job," replied Emily simply. "Not relevant?" questioned Edward, leaning forward. "Emily, you literally saved our daughter's life using medical knowledge that you deliberately hid from us." "What happened?" asked Lauren. "Why did you leave medicine? And how did you end up, well, working for us?" Emily looked out the window of the small room, observing the movement of the hospital outside. How many stories had those walls witnessed? Hers was just one more. "5 years ago, I discovered a fraud scheme at the hospital where I worked," she began, carefully choosing her words. "Some doctors were issuing false certificates and diverting medications. I reported it to the competent authorities, as was my ethical duty." "And what happened?" asked Lauren, genuinely interested. "What always happens to those who break the code of silence," replied Emily, with a sad smile. "I was isolated. Colleagues who once respected me began to avoid me. Shifts were cancelled, patients redistributed. Nothing official, nothing that could be proven as retaliation, just a gradual and systematic withdrawal." "And the reports?" questioned Edward. "They were archived due to lack of concrete evidence. The whistleblower's word against that of respected doctors in the community. Guess who lost?" The silence that followed was heavy, laden with simultaneous indignation and understanding. "Eventually, I resigned. I couldn't stand the hostile environment anymore. I thought I would find employment at another hospital, but I discovered that my reputation had been tarnished. Nobody wanted to hire the problematic doctor." "And your daughter?" asked Lauren, surprising Emily with the personal question. "Brooke was born with a heart condition. It's not serious, but it requires constant monitoring and medication. Without a steady job, I lost the health insurance that covered her treatment. That's when I decided to accept any job that offered medical benefits." "And so you came to us," concluded Edward, with a new understanding in his eyes. "Your employment agency didn't mention anything about your professional history," commented Lauren, frowning. "Because I didn't tell them," admitted Emily. "I learned the hard way that being overqualified closes more doors than it opens. Nobody wants to hire a former doctor to be a nanny or a cleaner. They think it's temporary, that the person will leave the job at the first opportunity." "And would you leave?" asked Edward with surprising frankness. "No," replied Emily, without hesitation. "Brooke needs the treatment that the health insurance provides. And besides," she hesitated, "I've grown fond of Madison. She reminds me of my daughter when she was younger." Lauren wiped a tear that was running down her perfectly made-up face. "I don't know what to say, Emily. Part of me is shocked to have been deceived all this time, but another part can only feel gratitude for what you did for Madison." "It wasn't my intention to deceive you," explained Emily. "I just needed the job and knew that my professional history would be an impediment." Edward stood up and walked to the window, his hands in his pockets, his countenance thoughtful. When he turned, there was a determination in his gaze that Emily recognized. It was the same look she used to see in the mirror years ago, when she still believed that doing the right thing always paid off. "I want to make you a proposal, Emily," he said with a firm voice. "Not as your employer, but as the father of a child you saved." "What kind of proposal?" she asked cautiously. "Madison's diagnosis, type 1 diabetes with autoimmune complications, will require constant care, monitoring, medication adjustments. She will need someone who understands not just basic care, but who has medical knowledge to identify warning signs." "Are you thinking of hiring a nurse?" asked Emily, feeling a tightness in her chest at the thought of being replaced. "We're thinking of redefining your role," interrupted Lauren, exchanging a knowing look with her husband. "From nanny to family health consultant, with a salary compatible with your training and experience." Emily blinked several times, unable to fully process what she was hearing. "I don't understand." "It's simple," continued Edward. "You continue taking care of Madison, but now officially using your medical knowledge. Additionally, we want you to develop a wellness program for our company's employees. But my registration with the medical board can be reactivated," completed Edward. "I have contacts who can help with the bureaucracy, And if there's any problem related to the past reports, I have lawyers willing to investigate. The offer was tempting, almost too perfect to be true. Emily felt a mixture of hope and distrust, feelings that had become familiar in recent years. "Why would you do this for me?" she asked, with the frankness that the situation required. "Because you saved our daughter," replied Lauren simply. "And because it's the right thing to do," added Edward. "You lost your career for doing what was right. In a way that makes me question how many times I've been passive in similar situations." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a nurse, informing them that Madison was ready to be discharged. The three returned to the room, where they found the girls laughing as if they were longtime friends. "Emmy!" exclaimed Madison upon seeing Lauren. "Brooke is so cool. She taught me a new game and told me that you're like a superhero who saved her life," she continued, looking at Emily. Brooke blushed, embarrassed. "I just told her that my mom helped when she felt sick." "Like a real doctor," completed Madison, excited. The adults exchanged significant looks as the pieces of the puzzle continued to fit together in unexpected ways. During the discharge process, Emily observed the dynamics of the Bailey family with new eyes. Edward, who had always seemed distant and absorbed in his own concerns, now paid attention to every detail of the medical instructions, asking pertinent questions and showing genuine concern. Lauren, in turn, seemed less focused on the perfect appearance and more on her daughter, hugging her frequently and listening attentively to her stories about the night in the hospital. In the parking lot, while waiting for the car that Edward had called, Emily felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned and found Dr. Richard with a serious and somewhat melancholy expression. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" he asked, casting a hesitant look at the Baileys, who were talking a few meters away. "Of course," replied Emily, moving a little away with her former colleague. "I didn't know you were working as a nanny," he began, visibly uncomfortable. "After you left the hospital, we lost touch and—" "You don't need to explain, Richard," interrupted Emily, with an understanding smile. "Everyone did what they thought was best at the time." "You were right, you know," he said, lowering his voice, "about the reports. Everything came to light a few months after you left. Some doctors were removed, there was an internal investigation." Emily felt a mixture of vindication and bitterness. "A little late for my career, don't you think?" "Yes, and I apologize for not supporting you when I should have," replied Richard with sincerity. "But maybe it's not too late now. The new director of Boston Medical Center is assembling a team for the pediatric cardiology department. If you're interested, I can mention your name." The offer caught Emily by surprise. After years of closed doors, now two were opening simultaneously. "Thank you, Richard, I'll think about it." When she returned to the Baileys, she found Edward observing her with curiosity. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Yes," replied Emily with a genuine smile. "Actually better than it has been for a long time." The car arrived and everyone got in. A doctor, a nanny, a businesswoman, an executive, and two children who, despite the social and age differences, had found an instant connection, an unlikely combination brought together by fate, chance, or perhaps something greater that Emily still couldn't name. As the vehicle moved away from the hospital, Emily looked out the window at the building that had once been her second home. She didn't know exactly what the future held, but for the first time in years, she felt that the possibilities were wider than the limitations, and that, in itself, was already a victory. The weeks that followed brought changes so rapid that Emily sometimes had to make a conscious effort to assimilate everything. Edward's proposal wasn't just words. In a matter of days, contracts were drawn up, lawyers consulted, and a new position was created especially for her. Health and Wellness Coordinator for the Bailey Group. The office she now occupied in the company's corporate building in downtown Boston in no way resembled the small apartment in Pinecrest Heights or the aseptic corridors of the hospital. Spacious, with a view of the Boston skyline, it was decorated with plants and paintings that conveyed tranquility, a deliberate contrast to the cold and impersonal rooms in the rest of the building. "I still can't believe all this is yours," commented Paula, the secretary Edward had assigned to help her. "Not even the directors have a view like this." Emily smiled, adjusting the frame of a photo on the desk, Brooke and Madison hugging, smiling at the camera during a picnic in Boston Common the previous Sunday. "I'm still getting used to the idea. Mr. Bailey seems really committed to this occupational health project," continued Paula, organizing some folders. "I've never seen him so involved in an initiative that wasn't directly related to the company's profits." "It's what I always tell Mr. Bailey," replied Emily, turning on her computer. "Health isn't an expense. It's an investment. Each employee who can adequately treat a chronic condition represents long-term savings, besides the human gain that's incalculable." The phone rang. It was Edward, asking if Emily could attend an unscheduled meeting in his office. She agreed, trying to ignore the familiar feeling of apprehension that still arose when she was called unexpectedly, a remnant of the difficult times at the hospital. On the way to the president's office, Emily greeted employees who already recognized her in the corridors. In just 3 weeks, she had initiated a basic medical screening program for all employees, identifying cases of undiagnosed hypertension, early-stage diabetes, and other problems that, if untreated, could evolve into more serious conditions. The initiative had been received with enthusiasm, especially by operational-level employees who rarely had access to preventive health care. Edward's secretary announced her arrival, and the door was opened immediately. To her surprise, Emily found not only Edward in the room, but also Lauren and a middle-aged man she didn't know. "Emily, glad you could come," greeted Edward, rising to receive her. "This is Dr. Michael Thompson, Director of St. Clair's Hospital. He has a proposal that I believe will interest you." Dr. Michael extended his hand with an affable smile. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you, Dr. Norton. I've heard a lot about your work in recent years." Emily felt her stomach churn. In recent years, her name was rarely mentioned in medical circles, and when it was, it usually came with suspicious looks and interrupted conversations. "The pleasure is mine, Doctor," she replied cautiously, "although I confess I'm surprised by your interest." "Please sit down," invited Edward, indicating a chair. "Dr. Michael is implementing an innovative project at St. Clair's Hospital, and I believe it's perfect to complement the work you're developing here." In the minutes that followed, the doctor explained his proposal, a training program for home caregivers focused on first aid and early identification of symptoms of chronic diseases. The idea was to create a basic care network in communities with limited access to health services. "When Edward told me your story and what you did for Madison, I realized you would be the ideal person to coordinate this project," concluded Dr. Michael. "Someone who understands both the medical aspect and the social reality of those who work as caregivers." Emily looked at Edward and Lauren, who were watching her expectantly. "I'm confused. Do you want me to leave my job here to take on this project at the hospital?" "Not at all," replied Edward quickly. "The idea is a partnership. You would continue as coordinator here and dedicate part of your time to the hospital project, which would be partially funded by the Bailey Group as part of our social responsibility." "And what about Madison?" asked Emily, thinking about the girl who still needed constant supervision to control her condition. "We would continue counting on you to guide her care," replied Lauren, "but we've hired a nurse for day-to-day care following your recommendations. You would be more of a supervisor than a direct caregiver." Emily took a deep breath, processing the information. "And my registration with the medical board? How would that work?" "We've already initiated the reactivation process," informed Dr. Michael. "With my endorsement and that of St. Clair's Hospital, I don't anticipate problems, especially considering that the reports you made years ago were subsequently proven." The news caught Emily by surprise. "How do you know about that?" "I was a member of the ethics committee that reviewed the case after you left Boston Medical Center," he replied, with an understanding look. "I always considered what happened to you unfair." Emily felt a lump in her throat. After years of feeling invalidated and forgotten, it was strange and comforting to hear that someone had recognized the injustice she had suffered. "I need to think," she finally said. "It's a generous proposal, but I need to consider how it will affect my daughter, my routine." "Of course," agreed Edward. "Take the time you need, but allow me to add a detail that might help in your decision. The project includes an internship program for final-year medical students. I thought it might be interesting for Brooke in the future, considering her interest in the medical field." Emily raised her eyebrows, surprised. "How do you know Brooke is interested in medicine?" It was Lauren who answered, with an affectionate smile. "Madison told us. Apparently Brooke wants to be a heart doctor just like her mum. The two have been talking a lot on the phone since they met." The idea that the girls had developed a genuine friendship, independent of the adults, touched Emily deeply. It was a reminder that, amid all the complications of the adult world, Children had a natural capacity to find meaningful connections. "Thank you for the opportunity," said Emily, standing up. "I promise to give my answer by the end of the week." When she left the room, she felt simultaneously exhausted and energized. It was as if she were waking up from a long period of hibernation, each cell in her body gradually remembering what it was like to be truly alive, not just surviving. At the end of the day, Emily decided to take a different bus than usual, one that would drop her off near Boston Medical Center. She hadn't planned this visit, but felt an almost magnetic impulse to return to the place where her life had changed so drastically. She walked slowly around the hospital, observing doctors, nurses, and patients coming and going. From the outside, everything looked the same. The same imposing building, the same automatic doors, the same constant flow of people. But she knew that inside, both the hospital and she herself had changed irrevocably. "Dr. Norton," a female voice interrupted her thoughts. Emily turned and found Rachel, a nurse with whom she had worked for years, older now, with grey strands in her once completely black hair, but with the same attentive look and warm smile. "Rachel, it's been so long," replied Emily, genuinely happy to see a friendly face from her past. "My God, it really is you," exclaimed the nurse, hugging her enthusiastically. "You won't believe it, but I was thinking about you just today. A patient came in with a case very similar to that gentleman on the 4th floor, remember? The one who had Takotsubo syndrome that no one could diagnose, and who only got better when we discovered his daughter was stealing his medication," completed Emily, surprised to remember so clearly a case from years ago. "Exactly. I've always used that case to teach new residents the importance of investigating the family context of patients." They talked for a few minutes, briefly updating each other on their lives. Rachel recounted that she now coordinated the cardiology nursing team and was visibly shocked to learn that Emily had worked as a nanny in recent years. "A shame what they did to you," she commented, indignant. "After you left, a lot came to light. Some of the doctors involved in the scheme were removed, others retired discreetly to avoid scandals." "I found that out recently," replied Emily, "but what matters now is moving forward." When they said goodbye, Rachel held Emily's hands firmly. "It's good that you're returning to medicine, Dr. Norton. We need professionals like you who aren't afraid to do what's right." Those simple words, spoken with sincerity, were like a balm for old wounds that Emily didn't even know were still open. She got on the bus that would take her home, with a feeling of lightness that she hadn't experienced in years. In the apartment, she found Brooke studying at the small kitchen table. The girl looked up when her mother entered and smiled, a smile that illuminated her face in a way that Emily hadn't seen for a long time. "How was your day, Mum?" asked Brooke, closing her science book. "Full of surprises," replied Emily, kissing the top of her daughter's head. "And yours?" "Cool. The biology teacher said my work on the circulatory system was the best in the class." "I'm not surprised," smiled Emily, sitting across from her daughter. "You've always had a facility with sciences." "I think I take after you," replied Brooke, with evident pride in her voice. "Did you know Madison called me today? She wanted to know if we can go to the planetarium together next weekend. Her dad said he can take us." Emily observed her daughter carefully. Rosier cheeks, brighter eyes, a different energy emanating from her. It wasn't just the adequate medical treatment provided by the health insurance, but something deeper. The joy of making a new friend, of having plans, of looking beyond physical limitations. "Sounds like a great idea," she replied, thinking about how her and Brooke's lives had intertwined in unexpected ways with the Bailey family. "And I have some news for you. I might be going back to work as a doctor soon, at least partially." Brooke's eyes widened. "Seriously, Mom, you're going to wear a white coat again?" "Maybe. I'm still deciding. It would be a special project, training people to better care for those who need it." "Like how you took care of me and Madison?" "Yes, something like that," smiled Emily, touched by her daughter's intuitive understanding. "What do you think?" "I think it's amazing," exclaimed Brooke with genuine enthusiasm. "You'll be able to help a ton of people. And who knows, maybe one day I can work with you." "Who knows?" replied Emily, feeling a wave of hope at imagining a future where her daughter would follow in her footsteps, but without carrying the burdens that she had carried. "Now tell me more about this biology work that impressed your teacher." While Brooke animatedly explained her project, Emily felt her cell phone vibrate. It was a message from Edward. "Madison won't stop talking about the planetarium. Thank you for allowing Brooke to be part of her life. It changed something we didn't even know needed changing. The simplicity and sincerity of the message brought tears to Emily's eyes. How unpredictable life was. All the tortuous paths, all the injustices and difficulties had somehow led to this moment. Her daughter happy, her career possibly rising from the ashes, and a family that had entered her life by chance now becoming a significant part of it. That night, lying in her simple bed in the small apartment that they would soon be able to exchange for a larger place, Emily allowed herself to dream again, not of grandeur or riches, but of a dignified life, where her knowledge and experience would be valued, where her daughter would have opportunities, where the invisible barriers that separated people like her from people like the Baileys could be, if not torn down, at least made more permeable. The week passed at an accelerated pace. Emily immersed herself in the development of the occupational health program at Edward's company, creating assessment protocols and identifying employees with specific medical needs. In her visits to different units of the Bailey Group, from the corporate offices to the factories in the metropolitan area, she clearly observed the disparities in access to healthcare among the different hierarchical levels. The factory workers in Chelsea have almost 3 times more cases of untreated hypertension than the administrative staff, she explained to Edward during an update meeting, and most of them only discover the problem when there's already significant damage. What do you suggest? He asked, analyzing the graphs she had prepared. A mobile health unit that can do regular screenings at the factories, associated with partnerships with nearby clinics for continued treatment, replied Emily, pointing to a map of Boston and the metropolitan area, where she had marked strategic points. The cost would be diluted over time by the reduction in absenteeism and increased productivity. Edward smiled, impressed with the pragmatic approach. Always arguing based on numbers, you've quickly learned the corporate language. I've learned that ideals need strategy to become reality, she replied with an ironic smile. Not everyone is convinced just by what is ethically right. Touché, laughed Edward. The mobile unit project is approved. And what about Dr. Michael's proposal? Have you decided if you'll accept? Emily nodded, feeling a mixture of excitement and apprehension. I'll accept. I believe I can contribute significantly, especially considering my experience from both sides. Great, replied Edward, standing up. I'm sure you'll do exceptional work, as you've been doing here. Before Emily could leave, Edward called her again. Oh, and Emily, Lauren asked me to remind you that Sunday dinner is still on. Madison is counting the days to show Brooke the new telescope she got. We'll be there, she promised, still getting used to this new dynamic, where the boundaries between professional and personal relationships were becoming increasingly fluid. On Friday of that week, Emily visited St. Clair's Hospital to better understand the structure and discuss the details of the project with Dr. Michael. As they walked through the corridors of the modern, well-equipped hospital, so different from the chaotic Boston Medical Center where she had worked for years, Emily noticed curious looks from the medical staff. Don't mind the looks, commented Dr. Michael, noticing her discomfort. Most are just curious about the doctor who reported the scheme at BMC and is now returning to medicine in such an innovative way. So, that's my reputation now? Asked Emily, half amused, half apprehensive. For some, yes. For others, you're the specialist that Edward Bailey, one of the most influential businessmen in the city, personally chose to lead his corporate health program. Stories change depending on who tells them. The observation was insightful and reminded Emily of how public perception could be fluid. The same action, reporting a fraud that had destroyed her career years ago, was now seen in a different light, thanks to the validation of authority figures like Edward and Dr. Michael himself. What matters is the work we'll do from now on, she stated resolutely. Past stories matter less than the lives we can impact now. Dr. E. Michael smiled with evident approval. That's exactly why I want you in this project, Dr. Norton. That ability to look beyond circumstances and focus on what really matters. On Sunday, Emily and Brooke prepared with special attention for dinner at the Baileys. It wasn't the first time they had gone there as guests, rather than as employee and employee's daughter, but there was still a certain nervousness, an acute awareness of the social differences that, despite everything, persisted. Do I look okay like this? Asked Brooke, twirling to show the simple but pretty dress that Emily had bought especially for the occasion. Beautiful, replied Emily, fixing a strand of her daughter's hair. Madison will love it. The taxi that Edward had sent arrived punctually, and during the journey Emily observed the city through the window, reflecting on the paths that had brought her there. From the community of Pinecrest Heights to the mansion in Beacon Hill, from the white coat to the nanny uniform, and now back to a renewed version of her professional identity. A complete circle, but with a different Emily, stronger and wiser than that young idealistic doctor who had once believed that truth would always prevail. Upon arriving at the mansion, they were greeted not by Lauren or Edward, but by Madison, who ran to hug Brooke with contagious enthusiasm. "Come see my telescope," she exclaimed, pulling her older friend by the hand. "You can see the craters on the moon." The girls disappeared toward the garden, leaving Emily alone in the entrance hall. For a moment she stood there, absorbing the contrast between this visit and all the other times she had entered that house as an employee. Same furniture, same walls, same stairs, but a completely different context. "They get along so well, don't they?" commented Lauren, appearing at the door of the living room. "It's as if they've been friends their whole lives." "Children have that capacity for immediate connection that we adults lose over time," replied Emily, following the hostess inside. The room was decorated for a more informal dinner than Emily expected. Edward was on the veranda, observing the girls in the garden with a look that mixed pride and a certain melancholy. "Thank you for coming," he said, upon noticing Emily's arrival. "It means a lot to Madison, and to us too." There was a sincerity in his voice that Emily had learned to recognize in recent weeks. It was the tone of someone who was relearning priorities, rediscovering what really mattered after years pursuing goals that in the end didn't bring real meaning. "The pleasure is ours," she replied, observing the girls below, one head of straight hair and another of voluminous curls, bent over the telescope, sharing discoveries and dreams under the starry sky of Boston. At that moment, Emily knew with certainty that she had made the right decision, not just in accepting the project at the hospital or the new position at the company, but mainly in allowing her and Brooke's lives to intertwine with the Bailey family in a way that transcended social barriers and conventions, because in the end, they were all just people trying to find their place in the world. A businessman rediscovering the value of fatherhood, a socialite learning to see beyond appearances, a girl fighting against a medical condition, a teenager overcoming physical limitations, and a doctor who had become a nanny and now found a new path, one that honored both her knowledge and her life experience. "I think we're all starting over, aren't we?" commented Lauren, joining them on the veranda. "In different ways, but equally significant." "Yes," agreed Emily with a serene smile. "And maybe that's exactly what all of us needed." Below, in the garden, Madison pointed to something in the sky, and Brooke carefully adjusted the telescope. Their laughter reached the adults, a pure and hopeful sound that promised brighter futures for all of them. 6 months passed like a breath of wind through the Massachusetts hills. Autumn tinged Boston with golden and reddish tones, creating a scene of transition that reflected the changes in the lives of all those involved in that unexpected story. The Bailey Group's mobile health unit completed its first semester of operation, with results that exceeded the most optimistic expectations. Parked that morning in the yard of the factory in Chelsea, the adapted van received an orderly line of employees for routine exams and preventive consultations. Emily, wearing a white coat over discreet but elegant clothes, attentively attended to a middle-aged worker who reported knee pain after years of working standing on the production line. "Mrs. Cecilia, we'll refer you to an orthopedist, but I'll also suggest some adaptations to your workstation," explained Emily, making notes on her tablet. "Small changes in the height of the bench and proper foot support can significantly reduce pressure on the joints." The woman smiled, grateful. "You're different from the other company doctors who have come through here, Dr. Emily. They barely looked at us. They just wanted to know if we were fit for work or not." "Maybe because I've been on the other side," replied Emily, with an understanding smile. "I know what it's like not to be seen." After concluding the morning appointments, Emily checked the data collected with the nursing team that accompanied her. The program had already identified dozens of cases of undiagnosed hypertension and diabetes, as well as orthopedic and respiratory problems related to working conditions. More importantly, it was implementing personalized solutions for each case, from medical treatments to ergonomic adaptations in workstations. "The numbers are impressive, Dr. Norton," commented Mark, the head nurse of the mobile unit. "Absenteeism in this unit has dropped almost 30% since we began the interventions." "It's what I always tell Mr. Bailey," replied Emily, organizing her things to leave. "Health isn't an expense, it's an investment. Each employee who can adequately treat a chronic condition represents long-term savings, besides the human gain which is incalculable." Upon leaving the factory, Emily checked her watch. She had exactly 1 hour before her meeting at St. Clair's Hospital. The Home Caregivers Training Project had expanded beyond initial expectations, attracting attention from other institutions and even from the municipal health department. In the parking lot, she found the driver that Edward had insisted on assigning to facilitate her complex logistics among various commitments. "To the hospital, Dr. Emily?" asked Anthony, opening the car door. "Yes, but can we quickly pass by Pinecrest Heights? I want to check how the apartment renovation is going." Emily's old apartment was being transformed into a small community health center, a personal project she had initiated with part of her new salary. The idea was to create a space where community residents could receive basic health guidance and referrals to the public network, reducing the distance between the vulnerable population and available services. Emily and Brooke had moved to a comfortable apartment in Back Bay, close enough to Beacon Hill to facilitate frequent visits to the Bailey's house, but without the ostentatious luxury that would make Emily feel out of place. It was a middle ground that well symbolized her new position in the world, neither the renowned doctor she had once dreamed of being, nor the invisible nanny she had become out of necessity, but something new and authentic, built from all her experiences. Upon arriving at Pinecrest Heights, Emily was received with hugs and smiles from former neighbors. Mrs. Zelda, who now coordinated the recruitment of local caregivers for the training program, proudly showed the new facilities of the community center. "We already have 15 people signed up for the next course, Emily," informed the lady, displaying the list of names. "Most already work taking care of elderly or children in the community, but without any formal training." "Exactly the profile we're looking for," replied Emily, satisfied. "People with a natural vocation for care who just need technical knowledge to enhance what they already do by instinct." After a quick inspection of the works, which were almost completed, Emily headed to St. Clair's Hospital. There, she found Dr. Michael in a meeting room, accompanied by representatives from the health department and a private university interested in incorporating the caregiver program into the nursing curriculum. "Dr. Norton, we were commenting on the impressive satisfaction rates of the program participants," said one of the department representatives, consulting a folder of documents. 95% classify the training as transformative for their professional practice. "The merit belongs to the team and mainly to the caregivers themselves," replied Emily with humility. "They bring a practical wisdom that no manual can teach. We just add technical knowledge to that base." The meeting extended for almost 2 hours, with discussions about expanding the program to other regions of the city and the possibility of transforming it into a replicable model at the state level. When it finally ended, Emily checked her cell phone and found a message from Lauren. "Don't forget Madison's piano recital today, 7 p.m. Brooke is already here. We picked her up from school. Formal attire, but I know you already knew that." Emily smiled, reading the message. It was still surprising how her daughter had integrated into the Bailey family's routine, spending afternoons at the mansion after school, participating in music classes with Madison, sharing language tutors, and, most importantly, developing a genuine friendship that transcended the circumstances that had brought them together. Upon leaving the hospital, Emily decided to make a quick stop at a store in the mall to buy a suitable dress for the recital. While trying on some options, her cell phone rang again. It was Edward. "Emily, sorry to bother you." His voice sounded tense, different from the usual confident tone. "Madison is having an anxiety attack before the recital. She's afraid of making mistakes in the song, says she can't breathe properly. Lauren tried to calm her, but it's getting worse. Brooke suggested we call you." "I'm on my way," replied Emily immediately. "Ask Brooke to stay with her and try to keep her in a calm environment, without too many stimuli." 40 minutes later, Emily was entering the Bailey mansion, being quickly led to Madison's room by a visibly concerned Lauren. "I've never seen her like this," whispered the mother as they climbed the stairs. "She's always been so confident with the piano." In the room decorated in pastel tones, They found Madison sitting on the edge of the bed, breathing rapidly while Brooke held her hand, speaking in a low and calm voice. Edward was standing by the window, his tense countenance betraying his concern. "Hello, little one," said Emily softly, approaching and kneeling in front of Madison. "I heard the piano is being stubborn today." The girl looked up, her face marked by tears. "I can't play right, Emmy. My hands keep shaking and I forget the notes." "You know our bodies sometimes do funny things when we're nervous," explained Emily, holding the small hands between hers. "It's as if we had an alarm inside us that sometimes goes off unnecessarily, like a crazy alarm clock that rings at the wrong time." The analogy drew a small smile from Madison. "I'll teach you a trick I use when I get nervous before an important surgery," continued Emily, aware that everyone in the room was watching her. "We close our eyes, breathe deeply through our nose, counting to 4, hold the air counting to 4, and release it very slowly through our mouth counting to 8. Want to try with me?" Madison nodded, closing her eyes and following Emily's instructions. Brooke spontaneously joined them, and soon Edward and Lauren were also participating in the breathing exercise, creating a moment of silent connection that seemed to suspend time within that room. After a few minutes, Madison's breathing had normalized, and her hands were no longer shaking so much. "Better?" asked Emily. "A little," replied the girl. "But what if I make a mistake in front of everyone?" "And what if you do?" returned Emily gently. "What happens if you miss a note or two?" Madison seemed confused by the question. "People will notice. They'll think I'm not good enough." "You know who sometimes misses notes?" "The greatest pianists in the world," intervened Brooke, surprising everyone with her wisdom. "I read it in a music magazine. They say that what's important isn't playing everything perfectly, it's making people feel something when they hear you play." Edward approached, sitting next to his daughter. "Your friend is right, Princess. Nobody expects perfection, not even your teachers. We'll be there to applaud your effort and your courage, not to count mistakes." "And what if I still get nervous at the time?" asked Madison, still insecure. "Then look at us in the audience," suggested Lauren, joining the group on the bed. "We'll all be there cheering for you. You can look at Brooke, or at Emily, or at us. Choose whoever makes you feel most secure." Those simple words, "choose whoever makes you feel most secure," reverberated in the room in a way that transcended the moment. In a way, it was what all of them had done in recent months, chosen each other as points of security in their lives. 2 hours later, seated in the front row of the music school auditorium, Emily, Brooke, Edward, and Lauren watched Madison climb onto the stage, wearing a light blue dress and a matching hair ribbon. The girl adjusted the piano stool, positioned her hands over the keys, and for a moment seemed to hesitate. Her eyes scanned the audience until finding the small group in the front row. Emily smiled encouragingly, and Madison returned the smile before beginning her presentation. The first notes of Fur-Elise filled the auditorium, performed with an emotion that compensated for any small technical imprecision that only very trained ears could perceive. Watching the girl play, Emily felt a wave of pride that went beyond professional satisfaction of seeing a recovered patient. It was something deeper, more personal, the pride of someone who had accompanied a growth, of someone who had been part of a journey. Beside her, Brooke watched fascinated, her fingers moving discreetly in her lap, as if mentally accompanying the melody. Edward and Lauren held each other's hands, a gesture of intimacy that had become more frequent in recent months, as they rediscovered not only their daughter, but also each other, through the changes that Emily had inadvertently provoked in their lives. When the presentation ended, the audience applauded enthusiastically. Madison made a small curtsy, her face illuminated by the joy of the challenge overcome. Before leaving the stage, her eyes met Emily's again, and in that look was a clear message that transcended words: gratitude, affection, and a newly discovered confidence. After the recital, during the small reception offered by the school, Emily observed from a distance the group that had formed around Madison: colleagues, teachers, Edward and Lauren receiving congratulations, Brooke taking photos with the new cell phone she had received for her birthday. "It's amazing how life comes full circle, isn't it?" commented a voice beside her. Emily turned and found Dr. Richard Matthews, her former colleague from Boston Medical Center, now Madison's pediatrician. "Richard, I didn't know you would come to the recital," she replied, surprised by the unexpected encounter. "I come to all the important events of my patients when possible," he explained. It's part of the integrated approach you always defended, remember? Knowing the child beyond the symptoms. I remember, smiled Emily, recognizing her own words from years ago. Good to see that some lessons persisted. Many of them, agreed Richard, with a thoughtful look. You know, after you left the hospital, things changed gradually. Your absence was felt more than you imagine. The system remains the same, Richard, replied Emily, without bitterness, just stating a fact. People like us come and go, but the structures remain. Not always, he contested. Sometimes one person can initiate a change that continues long after their departure, like ripples that expand when a stone falls in water. The metaphor was beautiful, but Emily knew that reality was more complex. Still, something in Richard's tranquility, in the way he spoke of changes, aroused her curiosity. Has the hospital changed that much? She asked. Not completely, of course, but enough for someone like you to consider returning if you want. The new director restructured the cardiology department, implemented more rigorous protocols of medical ethics, created safe channels for internal reports. The information caught Emily by surprise. She didn't seriously consider the possibility of returning to Boston Medical Center. The memories were too intense, both the good and the painful ones. I'm happy with my current projects, she replied diplomatically. The program at St. Clair's is growing, and the work at the Bailey Group has been extremely rewarding. Of course, Richard quickly agreed. I'm not trying to recruit you. I just thought you might like to know that your legacy remained, in a way. Before they could continue the conversation, they were interrupted by Madison, who ran up to them with Brooke right behind. Emmy, Dr. Richard, did you see? I played everything right. We did see, little one, smiled Emily, bending down to hug the girl. It was beautiful. Wonderful, agreed Richard, greeting his patient with a high five. Especially the finale. Very emotional. That's what Brooke taught me, explained Madison, looking with admiration at her older friend. She said the notes are important, but the feeling is more. Brooke blushed at the compliment. I just repeated what my mum always says about medicine. Her daughter's words touched Emily deeply. She had never imagined that her reflections on medical practice would be transmitted in this way, through Brooke, to a completely different area, like music. Edward and Lauren joined the group, bringing glasses of champagne for the adults and juices for the girls. A toast to our pianist, proposed Edward, raising his glass, and to everyone who made this night possible. As they toasted, Emily noticed how the circle they had formed, she, her daughter, the Baileys, even Richard, represented an unlikely constellation of lives that fate had intertwined. People from different worlds with distinct stories gathered in that moment of genuine celebration. Later, when the reception ended and everyone was preparing to leave, Edward approached Emily while the girls and Lauren chatted with some teachers. I have a surprise for you, he said, handing her an envelope. Intrigued, Emily opened it and found official documents with the Bailey Group letterhead. Reading the content, her eyes widened in surprise. Bailey Institute for Community Health, she asked, confused. Edward smiled with that mixture of pride and humility he had developed in recent months. The board approved it yesterday, an independent foundation, but linked to the group, to expand and institutionalize the work you started. It will have its own budget, administrative autonomy, and if you accept, you will be the executive director. Edward, this is... I don't know what to say, stammered Emily, genuinely at a loss for words. Say you accept, he replied simply. It's the next logical step. The work you initiated is too big to be restricted to a department of the company or a hospital project. It deserves its own structure, adequate resources, a dedicated team. The proposal was more than Emily had ever dreamed of, even in the times when she still believed that her medical career would follow a traditional and ascending path. It was the opportunity to create something truly transformative that combined her clinical experience with the social sensitivity she had developed over the years of difficulties. I need to think, she replied honestly. It's a huge responsibility. Of course, agreed Edward. Take the time you need. The complete documents are there, including the initial budget proposal and the preliminary guidelines I drafted based on what we've discussed in recent months. The care and seriousness with which Edward had prepared the proposal demonstrated more than simple gratitude for Madison's life. They revealed a genuine respect for Emily's work and vision. On the way back home, with Brooke asleep in the back seat of the car, Emily leafed through the documents in the dim light of the cabin, gradually absorbing the magnitude of the opportunity that presented itself. The Institute could unify and expand all the initiatives she had been developing separately. The occupational health program, the caregiver training, the community center in Pinecrest Heights. More than that, it could create a permanent bridge between worlds that rarely communicated as equals: the corporate environment, the healthcare system, and vulnerable communities. A bridge built not only with financial resources, but with knowledge, mutual respect, and a vision of health that transcended the simple absence of disease. Upon arriving at the apartment, Emily carried Brooke, who was still sleeping, to her bed. She observed her daughter's serene face, now healthier and rosier than a year ago, when they lived in the precariousness of the hill and depended exclusively on public health care for the necessary medical care. She sat in the armchair by the window, contemplating the city that stretched outside with its lights, its hills, its inequalities and its possibilities. The same Boston that had witnessed her rise as a doctor, her fall after the reports, her years as an invisible nanny, and now this new chapter that was opening. On the small table beside her, a photo in a simple frame caught her attention. Brooke and Madison at the planetarium, wide smiles as they pointed to a replica of the Milky Way on the ceiling. Two girls from different worlds, united by unlikely circumstances, creating together a new universe of possibilities. That was what the Institute could represent on a larger scale, thought Emily. A space where different realities could coexist and mutually enrich each other, where the technical knowledge of medicine would ally with the practical wisdom of communities, where executives and workers, doctors and informal caregivers, could build together a more humane and efficient healthcare system. She took her cell phone and typed a message to Edward. "I accept. Let's build this bridge together." The response came almost immediately. "I knew you would accept. Madison said you never refuse the chance to help more people. She knows you well." Emily smiled. It was true. The girl knew her well, perhaps better than many adults who had crossed her path. It had been Madison, after all, who had first seen beyond the silent facade of the nanny, who had asked questions that no one else had bothered to ask, who had noticed the precision of her care and the depth of her knowledge. And it had been through Madison, through her crisis, her vulnerability on that rainy night, that all their worlds had collided and transformed. Like a small grain of sand that, upon entering an oyster, triggers the formation of a pearl. The next morning, Emily woke up before the alarm with renewed energy and a clarity of purpose she hadn't felt in years. She prepared breakfast while Brooke was still sleeping, taking advantage of the morning silence to mentally organize the first steps she would take as the future director of the Institute. When her daughter finally appeared in the kitchen, disheveled hair and still sleepy eyes, Emily smiled. "Good morning, sleepyhead. We have news to discuss." "Good morning," replied Brooke, sitting at the table. "What news?" As she shared the plans for the Institute, Emily observed her daughter's reactions, the initial surprise, followed by growing enthusiasm as she understood the implications of the project. "Does this mean you'll be like the boss of everything?" asked Brooke, impressed. "Something like that," laughed Emily. "It means I'll be able to help more people like us, who need adequate medical care but face barriers. And it also means I'll be able to teach other professionals to see patients as complete people, not just as symptoms, like you always wanted," observed Brooke, with that acute perception that sometimes surprised Emily. "Yes, like I always wanted," she agreed, realizing the truth in those words. "I just didn't imagine the path would be so complicated," suggested Brooke. "Unexpected," corrected Emily with a smile. "But maybe it needed to be that way. Maybe I needed to experience both sides to really understand." That same afternoon, upon entering the Bailey Group headquarters for a preliminary meeting about the Institute, Emily was received not as the ex-nanny who had saved Madison's life, nor as the doctor who had developed the occupational health program, but as a leader whose vision was about to transform into a concrete institution. Edward awaited her in the main meeting room, along with a small group of executives and consultants. At his side, to Emily's surprise, was Dr. Michael from St. Clair's Hospital, and even more surprisingly, Dr. Richard from Boston Medical Center. "Welcome, Dr. Norton," greeted Edward formally, but with a warm smile. "Or should I say, Director Norton? We've gathered some people who I believe are fundamental for the initial phase of the Institute. The meeting that followed was intense and productive. Plans were drawn, institutional partnerships discussed, schedules established. The Institute was taking shape not just as an extension of existing initiatives, but as something new and ambitious, a model that could eventually be replicated in other cities and regions. At the end, when most of the participants had already left, Edward, Dr. Michael, and Dr. Richard remained with Emily for a more informal conversation. "You know what's most extraordinary about this whole story," commented Dr. Michael, leaning back in his chair, "how something potentially tragic, a child's health crisis, transformed into the catalyst for a project that will benefit thousands of people. It's what we call serendipity in science," added Richard. "Valuable discoveries that happen by chance when you're looking for something completely different." "It wasn't exactly by chance," corrected Edward, looking directly at Emily. "It was because someone decided to do what was right, even when it was difficult. Twice, actually. First by reporting the frauds at the hospital, then by acting quickly to save Madison." Emily felt the weight of those words, not as a burden, but as a recognition of a fundamental truth that had always guided her actions, even in the darkest moments. "Maybe that's what we're really building with the Institute," she reflected. "Not just a health program, but a space where doing what's right is the rule, not the exception. Where professionals can follow their vocation without fear of retaliation, where patients are seen in their entirety, where social and economic barriers don't determine who receives adequate care." "Ambitious," smiled Dr. Michael. "But if anyone can achieve this, it's you, Emily." When the meeting finally ended, Emily decided to walk a bit before picking up the car to get Brooke from school. She walked a few blocks in downtown Boston, observing the movement of the city. Hurried executives, street vendors, students, retirees, all sharing the same urban space, but living drastically different realities. Her cell phone vibrated with a message from Madison. "Emmy, Uncle Michael said you're going to have an institute all your own. Can I be a volunteer when I grow up? I want to help just like you helped me." The simplicity and enthusiasm of the message brought tears to Emily's eyes. This was it, she realized. The true impact of her actions wasn't just in the programs she created or the institutions she helped build, but in the seeds she planted in young hearts like Madison's and Brooke's, seeds that would grow long after she was no longer present, creating shadows under which others could rest and flourish. It was a form of immortality more meaningful than any professional recognition or social status. She typed an affectionate response to Madison, promising that there would always be a place for her at the Institute, and continued her walk, feeling connected not only with her past and present, but also with a future that she was helping to shape through her daily choices. At the corner of a busy avenue, Emily stopped upon spotting a middle-aged woman wearing a nanny uniform, holding the hand of a small child, while they waited for the light to change. There was a silent dignity in the woman's posture, a careful attention in the way she protected the child from the intense traffic. For a moment, Emily saw herself in that anonymous woman, the invisible nanny who walked daily between Pinecrest Heights and Beacon Hill, carrying not just a backpack with personal belongings, but also knowledge, skills, and temporarily dormant dreams. How many other Emilys existed in that city? How much wasted talent? How many interrupted vocations? How many potential contributions lost because the system didn't create spaces for people of all backgrounds to flourish? The Institute would be just one step, a small step towards a more just and humane world. But it was a significant step, and Emily was determined to take it with all the strength and wisdom she had accumulated in her improvised journey through the different worlds of Boston. Because in the end, she had discovered that her true vocation wasn't just being a doctor, or a caregiver, or an executive, but rather a bridge builder, someone capable of connecting distinct realities and creating spaces where people could meet as equals, despite their differences. And perhaps that was exactly what the world needed most. Not more isolated specialists in their towers of knowledge, nor more invisible workers serving silently, but people who could transit between these worlds and weave meaningful connections, transforming individual stories of pain and overcoming into collective movements of change. Emily smiled to herself, adjusting the strap of her bag on her shoulder as she resumed her walk. The path ahead would be challenging, no doubt, with obstacles she couldn't yet foresee. But for the first time in many years, she felt she was exactly where she should be, doing exactly what she was born to do. It wasn't the end of the story, she knew, It was just the beginning of a new chapter, not only for her but for all whose lives would be touched by the work she was about to begin. A work that had started, ironically, when she ceased being Dr. Norton to become just Emily, the nanny that nobody noticed but who saw everything.